Are we alone in the universe? No single question has evoked as much speculation and wonder, save perhaps that of life after death, the infinite heavens a glittering tapestry unfurled over us every night of our lives. Science has yet to provide us with an answer, though many laymen have found one in the seemingly endless claims of UFO sightings throughout the past century. A tiny percentage of these sightings involve observation of extraterrestrials, whether incidentally or through direct contact. Of course, the burden of proof lies entirely with the person or persons making the claim, but it may surprise some that a select few of these wild tales are not quite as wild as they first seem, and the associated burden of proof is unnervingly within reach. The moon was full and still ascending in the eastern sky over the Mississippi Gulf Coast. 42-year-old Charles Hickson and 19-year-old Calvin Parker Jr. sat on the bank of the Pascagoula River, dangling their feet off the side of the Saltpeter Dock, a dark, disused spot just upstream from the F.B. Walker & Sons shipyard, where both men were employed. After a long day of work, the two men found solace in each other's company, spending the better part of the evening puttering up and down the riverside in Hickson's car in an unsuccessful bid to land a few redfish or speckled trout. A quiet, lantern-jawed young man, Parker had recently moved from his home in the agricultural town of Tucker's Crossing, about 100 miles to the north. Currently, he boarded with the Hickson family at their house in nearby Gaucher. Hickson was a friend and frequent fishing buddy of Parker's father, and no doubt saw his companion as an analog of his own son, Eddie, who was stationed half a world away in Okinawa as a United States Marine. As the evening wore on and evolved into night, and the normally fruitful Saltpeter Dock proved itself to be more bust than boon, the men debated whether they should cut their losses and go home. Hickson chose to give the fish a little more time to bite, and reached behind himself to grab some bait. At first, Hickson described hearing a zipping sound, then glancing up in astonishment to watch a 25 to 30 foot long, 10 foot high ovoid object with rotating or pulsating blue lights descend about 75 to 120 feet away, where it hovered about a foot off the sandy patch of ground. Oblivious to the goings-on, Parker suddenly became aware of a strange blue glow from somewhere behind. He stood up and turned around. Quote, "It looked like a patrol car, because we was actually trespassing on private property, and I was thinking they were down here to run us off." Unquote. It soon became obvious police had little to do with what he was seeing. A moment passed, and the men watched spellbound as a rectangular opening appeared on the side of the object, intense light spilling into the night air. 3 humanoid figures appeared in the opening. Quote, "By the expression on Calvin's face, I knew I wasn't seeing this alone. I couldn't control myself. I shook from fear as Calvin screamed." Unquote. The entities disembarked and approached the dock, closing the distance within seconds. Hickson later described the entities' movements as gliding, their feet never coming closer than 6 inches from the ground, their legs never seeming to separate, as if fused together. According to Hickson, the entities were about 5 foot in height and covered in gray, wrinkled skin, or possibly fabric, that he at one point likened to that of an elephant. They also had what he described as bullet-shaped heads without necks, mitten or claw-like hands, and bizarre conical features where noses and ears should have been, although there were no eyes, though he admitted that this observation may have been incorrect, owing to the abundant wrinkles covering their faces. 2 of the entities firmly grabbed Hickson, one on each arm, while the third took hold of Parker, who, according to Hickson, suddenly went limp. Later, Parker would explain that he had, in fact, passed out. While he experienced a very brief jolt of pain when first under the creature's sturdy grip, Hickson described a sense of general paralysis and found himself unable to even close his eyes. Fatal thoughts raced through his mind as his captors whisked him toward and into the interior of the brightly lit craft, where he soon found himself in some kind of round, empty room. Although he had lost sight of Parker, it is reasonable to assume the young man was taken into a separate room or area. Hickson remained suspended in the air as the entities released him, his paralyzed body momentarily rotating into a 45-degree position by some unseen force. Then, as if things weren't strange enough, a large eye-like device about the size of a football came out of the wall. The device came to within a few inches from his face and slowly panned down and up the length of his body, presumably performing some type of scan. The device retracted back into the wall, and after some indeterminate amount of time, the entities carried Hickson back outside to the dock, where Calvin Parker stood frozen in place, his arms outstretched and face a rictus of terror. Hickson collapsed to the ground as the entities returned to the object. As he climbed to his feet, he heard a zipping sound and turned just in time to see the object rise into the air and vanish in a flash of light. Once Hickson was able to shake Parker from the clutches of cosmic terror, the two spent perhaps 45 minutes sitting in the car, deliberating their next move as the older man took several swigs of liquid courage from a whiskey bottle. Supposedly, Parker was reluctant to tell anyone, fearing social repercussions. This is somewhat understandable, as he had nearly his entire life ahead of him. To admit to something as fringe as a UFO kidnapping would drastically limit his chances of everything from future employment to marriage. Hickson, on the other hand, insisted that someone in authority should know, in case their experience was the prelude to an invasion, a seemingly quaint but still marginally sound theory, especially considering the emotional context. They drove into the town of Pascagoula and quickly found a payphone. Perhaps recalling the well-known Project Blue Book, the United States Air Force's investigation into UFOs that had ended 4 years prior, Hickson first called Keesler Air Force Base in Biloxi, 30 miles to the west. A sleepy-sounding female sergeant answered the phone and listened as Hickson explained the events of the past hour. The sergeant politely informed him that the Air Force no longer handled such matters and suggested he contact Pascagoula law enforcement for further assistance. Hesitant to inform local authorities, undoubtedly due to the mocking incredulity they were likely to face, and possibly because to do so would include an admission of trespassing, as the Salpeter dock was private property, Hickson suggested they instead tell their story to the town newspaper, the Mississippi Press Register. Upon finding the paper's office closed for the night, the men finally resigned themselves to the inevitable and banged on the register's front windows, persuading the janitorial staff to let them in and allow them to call the Jackson County Sheriff. The call was taken by dispatcher Mike Robichaud and passed to Captain Glenn Ryder, who, unsurprisingly, reacted to Hickson's tale with laughter. To his credit, he took the men seriously enough to have them escorted to the office where they could make an official statement. They arrived about 11:18 p.m. and were immediately given a breath analyzer test by Sheriff Fred Diamond, who considered the story an obvious hoax. Hickson freely admitted to consuming alcohol, and Parker's sobriety was confirmed. Both men seemed shaken badly, but able to converse intelligibly. 2 hours of questions followed, with Hickson and Parker separately interviewed by Sheriff Diamond and Captain Ryder. Both men twice related the night's events to the best of their individual recollections. Eventually, Hickson and Parker were both moved to the office of Detective Thomas Huntley, a room wired for concealed audio recording of suspects. The recording device was covertly started, and Hickson was asked by a deputy to relate the events for a third time, which he did reluctantly, while Parker sat silent. After about 30 minutes, Sheriff Diamond excused himself and the deputy under the pretext of grabbing some coffee. The men were left alone.
About something like that, but you can't believe it.
Yeah, you hear that. I know.
Maybe something the United States can have up there.
No, it is. No, it's really
They wouldn't have done no
not what we seen, though. Not what we seen. It's something, and the Air Force and all know it's up there, too, see. And this ain't going to be the only time it's going to happen again.
This season, I like had a heart attack tonight, ain't she?
Well, I know.
And one day, me
I
too.
know that scared me to death, too, something.
I'm just laying there crying right now. I can't
Yeah, I know that. It's something that you can't get over in a lifetime, you see. Jesus Christ.
Most of them bad about it, nobody believes. That's
And
what
I thought I had been through enough of hell on this earth, and now I have to go through something like that, see. But they could have, I guess they could have harmed us, son. They could have done anything to us if they didn't hurt me.
maybe why they just picked us up.
I don't know. I'm telling you, man, I couldn't take much more of that.
I go I'm going to bed and get some nerve pills or something, see the doctor or something. I can't stand it. I'm about to go all crazy.
I'll tell you about it when they get through us. We go by the prayer. I I'll get you something to settle you down with so you get some damn sleep.
I keep sleeping out like it is. I understand you're crazy.
But Cal, when he brought you out of that damn thing, and when he brought me out, well, I like to know where the hell you know. God damn, I like to know where the hell got you straightened out, man.
I didn't know it. I remember my arm, they just froze out just like that. I couldn't move, just like I was stepping on a damn rattlesnake.
But they didn't do me that way, though.
I passed out. I passed out. That's the first time I ever passed out in my life. You check the new medical records. Ain't it?
I've never seen nothing like that before in my life. It's hard. You can't make people believe that, though.
I don't know if you're going to believe it or not, because I
They better wake up and start believing.
Damn
They
right.
better wake up and start believing.
Damn right. Listen, I seen it. I can't figure out the damn door. You see how that door will come around on that side of the chair?
Yeah, I don't know how to open something. I don't know.
I didn't see no door swing open.
I don't know how to open. I don't know how to open.
Shit on it. All I do is just see something and look around and them damn blue lights and them son bitches are just like that to come out.
Yeah, I know. You can't believe it. You can't make people believe it.
I paralyzed right there. I couldn't
They
move.
won't believe it one of these days. They won't believe it one of these days. Might be too late. I knew all along they was people from out of the world up there. I knew all along. I never thought it would happen to me.
In regards to the tape conversation, Captain Glenn Ryder told Mississippi Press Register reporter Murphy Givens, quote, "I thought they were pulling my leg. The young boy was scared to death. He was almost in shock. I didn't believe their story at first, but I do now after I got them on tape. If they were lying to me, then they should be in Hollywood." Unquote. Hickson and Parker eventually found themselves back at the Walker shipyards, struggling to get through the workday carrying the heavy weight of an unexplainable memory, the burden made all the worse by a sleepless night. As the morning dragged on, Sheriff Diamond telephoned the shipyard office and asked the men to return to the station. Someone apparently leaked the story publicly, and press reporters were now harassing the sheriff to no end. Learning of his employees' rather unique experience, shipyard owner John Walker contacted his brother-in-law, Jackson County Attorney Joe Kalingo, to secure representation for the men for any future public appearances. Soon, Kalingo arrived at the shipyard and, perhaps sensing a financial opportunity, accompanied both men back to the sheriff's office, hoping he could verify the men's story with a polygraph examination. Although no such examination was performed at this time, as the office did not have a polygraph machine, Hickson and Parker's story and general sincerity caught the attention of Detective Huntley, who decided to take personal charge of any subsequent investigation. Detective Huntley and Kalingo immediately took the men to nearby Singing River Hospital. Hickson had openly wondered if either the UFO or associated entities had been radioactive, and Detective Huntley considered verifying this the most prudent next step. Undoubtedly, there was some concern about the men's health, but medical confirmation of recent radiation exposure would be very strong circumstantial evidence. Like the sheriff's office, Singing River was not properly equipped for the necessary tests, and Huntley consequently contacted Keesler Air Force Base, ironically the place which passed on Hickson's report the night before, and arranged a medical examination and interview. Within an hour, Hickson and Parker were at Keesler, undergoing a short battery of medical tests, all the while scrutinized by security personnel, as well as, oddly, a veterinarian. Although the final report indicated the men were suffering from some nebulous mental stress, no radiation exposure was found. Afterward, the men were asked a series of questions, most of which originated from a Lieutenant Colonel Darrington, with occasional asides by health physicist Major Winans and a hospital service officer named Colonel Rudolph. As had the sheriff several hours earlier, Colonel Darrington grilled the men extensively about their experience. Later, Charles Hickson opined, quote, "Once again, we told what happened to us. I honestly believe they believed our story," unquote. That afternoon, Hickson, Parker, and Calvin Parker's father met with attorney Kalingo in his office to sign a contract for legal representation. The relationship would be a short-lived one, however, as Hickson would grow increasingly suspicious of the attorney's motives, and Kalingo would grow ever more frustrated as the lucrative contracts he foresaw never seemed to materialize. Learning of the incident through independent news sources, astrophysicist J. Allen Hynek, one-time scientific consultant for Project Blue Book and head of the astronomy department at Northwestern University, and James Harder, professor of civil and hydraulic engineering at UC Berkeley and a director of research for APRO, the Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, traveled to Pascagoula to meet Hickson and Parker. An executive office at the Walker shipyard reserved for their use, Hynek and Harder interviewed the two men about the events of the prior Thursday. An experienced amateur hypnotist, Harder attempted to place the men under hypnosis to obtain further details through regression. This had very limited success. While entranced, Hickson claimed to have vivid recall of the entities as they exited the craft, by now referred to almost exclusively as robots, but little else, eventually brought back to full consciousness as he was becoming overwhelmed by fear. Parker's reaction was apparently similar and equally emotional. Both men were left shaken, but Hickson admitted to being finally free of a severe headache that had been plaguing him for 2 days. The interview having concluded, Hynek and Harder gave an impromptu press conference to the news crew now swarming the area. Their conclusions were confident and unequivocated, if somewhat self-serving. Quote, "They are not unbalanced people. They're not crackpots. There was something here that was not terrestrial. Where they come from and why they were here is a matter of conjecture, but the fact that they are here is true beyond a reasonable doubt." Unquote. Though they may have been ultimately correct, it should be pointed out that Hynek's and Harder's academic reputation gave their respective opinions a level of unwarranted gravitas. Neither of them had real-world experience in psychological matters, and nothing learned through Hickson and Parker's hypnosis was qualitatively different than information consciously obtained by either Sheriff Diamond or the security personnel at Keesler. Moreover, Harder's understanding of the term reasonable doubt is rather unique, to say the least. There is certainly enough circumstantial evidence to support a deeper investigation into Hickson and Parker's story, but to behave as if no other explanation should even be entertained willfully tosses out any pretense of scientific diligence. No doubt both Hynek and Harder placed a great deal of weight on the men's visceral reactions while under hypnosis, a somewhat questionable conclusion, as illustrated by the opinion of Boston psychiatrist Dr. Ben Simon in regards to the famous UFO abduction case of Betty and Barney Hill. Quote, "Hypnosis is not a magical and royal road to the truth." Unquote. Because of the possibility or even likelihood of induced confabulation, the inevitable gap-filling an individual is likely to engage in when confronted with incomplete vaporous memories, hypnosis cannot be used as any sort of definitive proof. Hickson and Parker, like anyone under hypnosis, may recall an objective truth, or they may simply tell the therapist exactly what they want to hear based on an inadvertently leading question. A tsunami of media attention would deluge the area during the remainder of the month. Newspapermen, television reporters, UFO enthusiasts, and armchair experts inundating the town of Pascagoula and the Walker shipyard, trying to gather information about and secure interviews with the pair who had been kidnapped by the clawmen from outer space. The office of shipyard manager Orville Bryant, happy to gain respite from the ever-present throng of reporters, even took a call from Senator and former Iowan Governor Harold Hughes, who strangely thought the manager would know why extraterrestrials would be interested in American shipbuilding. Everyone was desperate and would go to extreme ends to acquire the secret tape made by Sheriff Diamond, which in the minds of many was quickly becoming the best evidence for UFOs ever produced, and was by this point anything but a secret. According to Joe Eszterhas, in an article written for Rolling Stone magazine, the National Broadcasting Company even sunk to the level of screening a pornographic film for sheriff deputies with the aim of persuading them to release the tape. The ploy was unsuccessful, as was the attempt by a particularly aggressive reporter from Biloxi, who had to be physically restrained as he implored the sheriff to allow him access to Hickson and Parker, screaming about the earth-shattering import of his task. Nationally, the story was fodder for open mockery. A cartoon in the Atlanta Constitution paradoxically depicted the entities with bugged eyes and fish scales. Johnny Carson goaded nearly 2 solid minutes of laughter from his audience about the matter. Back in Pascagoula, the local populace was in a far less congenial mood, strange creatures with the power to whisk anyone away at the drop of a hat, an ever-present concern. In the local gun shop, firearm and ammunition sales reached their highest since the early 1960s. To the north, in George County, a passing Air Force helicopter had been fired upon by trigger-happy civilians. No one was injured in the incident, and there was really no way to know if it had anything to do with UFOs. But the sheriff certainly believed there was a connection, as the news of Hickson and Parker's experience had created, in his words, quote, a forum panic, unquote. Perhaps the most egregious example of ancillary insanity is told by Pascagoula police officer Jeff Green. Quote, "We got a call from a lady who wanted to know if it was a fact that creatures were coming for us, and that they had found 38 dead people on the beach. I told her no way, and she said, just like I figured, the clawmen are raping and murdering men and women, and you're digging holes and hiding the cadavers. Unquote. The question of a polygraph had seemingly fallen by the wayside, as Joe Calingo spent the better part of 2 weeks garnering wider exposure for his new clients. Though most of these attempts bore little fruit, he was able to land spots for Hickson and Parker on several national talk shows, including, most famously, The Dick Cavett Show on the American Broadcast Company network. This, along with growing local curiosity, prompted the attorney to finally secure a polygraph examination, hoping to bolster the men's credibility as much as possible before sending them into the arena of public discourse. Calingo contacted the Pendleton Detective Agency in New Orleans and arranged for a test to be given by the end of the month. Unfortunately, a day before the scheduled test, Calvin Parker was admitted to a hospital in Laurel, Mississippi, and was, as a consequence, unable to attend. Later, according to Hickson, Calingo, and even Parker himself, the cause of the sudden hospitalization was anything from exhaustion, mental instability, seasonal flu, or a combination of all three. While any of these explanations are reasonable in the context of experiencing a UFO abduction, which would indeed be an extraordinarily stressful event, the oddly convenient timing of Parker's deteriorated condition certainly seems suspicious, and does make one wonder if the young man knew more than he was letting on.